The president's really smart, just ask him.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Things are moving kind of swiftly now in Syria, including the exit of some U.S. troops, and I think it's important that we get an understanding as to what's actually going on there before we get our panties too much in a bundle, right? So let's talk about that tonight. Great to have you aboard. Thanks for tuning in on this Tuesday evening. Lieutenant General Reginald Centracchio, he's the Adjutant General, Rhode Island, emeritus, of course, an advisor to Eyewitness News, and somebody who I rely on for a lot of perspective on the military stuff is my guest. In the meantime, let's start with at least a headline from yesterday and this notion that the president, in his great and unmatched wisdom, will totally destroy and obliterate the economy of Turkey if he needs to, in the midst of all of this movement of troops out of northern Syria. Not easy to understand. Here's one network package that tries to bring it together from earlier today.
We have to bring our people back home.
During a briefing with military leaders last night, President Trump defended his decision to withdraw American troops from northern Syria.
We were down to very few soldiers in Syria. We had 50 in the region that you're talking about, 50 soldiers. And they've been already moved out.
These images capture the U.S. troops evacuating observation posts and abandoning the U.S.-backed Kurdish forces that have shouldered much of the fight against ISIS.
Too many times America in the past has left our allies behind.
Some of the president's staunchest Republican allies in Congress wasted no time condemning his decision. Pat Toomey called it a threat to our national security. Liz Cheney described it as a catastrophic mistake. And Lindsey Graham said it's a shot in the arm to the bad guys, devastating for the good guys. Even Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said the move would increase the risk that ISIS and other terrorist groups regroup.
I respect both opinions. The problem with the other opinion is, when do we leave? When do we leave? We're going to stay there forever?
The fear of a resurgence by ISIS stems partly from the possibility that an attack by Turkey could jeopardize the security of prisons controlled by the Kurds that hold roughly 10,000 ISIS prisoners, about 2,500 of whom are highly dangerous foreign fighters. The White House statement Sunday said Turkey would take custody of foreign fighters. After first saying Turkey will soon be moving forward with its long-planned operation in northern Syria, President Trump changed his tune, tweeting, "If Turkey does anything that I, in my great and unmatched wisdom, consider to be off limits, I will totally destroy and obliterate the economy of Turkey."
Welcome, General. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks. Good to be here.
This question is certainly not meant to insult, just broad. Do you get what's going on here?
I do.
Okay, good. Because a lot of people. Good, because that's why we brought you in here. No. I mean, it's a little bit of a policy and procedural question mark for a lot of Americans. Not that a lot of Americans are thinking about policy and procedure in the Middle East. So before we get into the acute decision by the president, let's talk about the environment that exists right there now, right? So the Kurds who are in Syria, in Turkey, in Iran, are viewed very differently depending on whose perspective. Turkey views them as terrorists.
Correct.
Why?
The Kurds want their own piece of geography.
Yeah, they can't get it.
Well, that's what they want. So I think that to answer your question a little bit more distinctly, we have to recognize it's a very complex region, many moving parts, each with a different agenda. The Kurds have their agenda, and that's to eventually establish a Kurdistan, which means taking some geography from Turkey, perhaps some from Syria, but to establish their own nation. That's number one. Turkey views them as a threat to Turkey, and they view them as terrorists. Syria views them as anti-Syrian because they're not backing the Assad regime. The United States views them as, okay, they helped us retain and contain ISIS, and they have them under control.
And they were very helpful in Iraq.
Exactly. Iraq, that whole region, basically.
Right.
But I think we had, first of all, back to the decision by the president. I'm not that smart. I'm not the president. But I do believe that it's the right move at the wrong time. There has to be a better strategy to exit that area. And he was elected on the basis of bringing our troops home. Wholly, I disagree. I agree with that. But I think right now, moving troops away from northern Syria and away from the Kurds will hurt us more than they will help us for several reasons. First and foremost is the Kurds have been an extremely important ally to us. They are viewing this as turning our backs on them. Now you're on your own. We also recognize that Turkey has made a substantial threat that they intend on going and taking out the Kurds because they view them as terrorists. So moving the United States troops out, only 50, keep in mind, from this particular region. The job of the U.S. troops at this time was to give them the ability to gather intelligence, establish outposts, and to be able to feed intelligence to the Kurds in order for them to continue their mission of maintaining and containing the ISIS prisoners, as well as keeping them from growing. There are two considerations that I look at. Number one, it's doing away with an important ally if we move now. Secondly, I'm more concerned about what happens to the 10,000 ISIS prisoners, because Turkey now says they're going to take care of them. I don't really believe that.
How many Kurds do we have in northern Syria?
I'm not sure, several thousand at least.
And they've established residency there. They have a way of life there, and they're managing some 10,000 ISIS prisoners.
Correct.
There. Anybody else managing those prisoners?
To the best of my knowledge, no. But Turkey says they will assume that responsibility, and therein lies my concern. I don't think that's going to happen. I think what will happen is, and once again, I don't have the wisdom that other people suggest they do. I believe that if Turkey goes in and takes out the Kurds, so will those ISIS prisoners be released. And that's my major concern. And they will, in fact, attempt to regroup, giving everybody in that region a larger problem that we're looking at right now.
But what is this? What does taking out mean? Well, does Turkey have a plan to attack?
Well, he said that yesterday.
Yeah, he wants to roll in, but I mean, do they want to occupy, or do they want to be aggressive in terms of, mowing down these people?
I think they want to establish some kind of control over the Kurds to let them know they're not going to have their own nation.
But what does that mean?
It could mean an all-out war. It could mean, physical confrontation.
Because the Kurds aren't going to put up with that.
No, absolutely
They're
not.
going to fight to the death.
They will. And that's the gamble we're taking,
But I don't understand the genesis of this decision, other than an itch to scratch and a wag the dog in the middle of everything else that's going on at this point. Because what was the immediate urgency to get this done right now?
Well, I think if you go back to my initial concern was it's the right move because he was elected on that basis of moving troops out. I agree with that.
You know what? All due
It's the
respect,
wrong time.
politically, yeah, you really think that Donald Trump was elected on the basis of an isolationist policy or moving troops out? I mean, there were a lot of things that were in front of that in the consciousness of the American public.
I don't think isolationist was part of that reason he got in. I think saying he was going to stop the war or end the war after some 18 years now, that was part of what people migrated to. So I think there are two different issues there. My concern is we need to move troops out. We can't stay there forever. But the timing of it is the wrong time right now, especially when you take on the Kurds, who have given us tremendous support in the form of a trusty ally. They have maintained stability in the northern part of Syria by maintaining the imprisonment of those 10,000 ISIS fighters. Otherwise, they'd be on the street and regrouping and having more concern than we have right now.
All right, so when we come back, we'll talk about what the right timing would be. Stay with us. So again, reminding us about what we're discussing.
Turkish forces are moving into position along the Syrian border after American soldiers withdrew from the area. Turkey is expected to mount an offensive against the Kurdish population there. For years, the Kurds have fought ISIS alongside U.S. troops. In a statement, Kurdish leaders called President Trump's decision to pull out, quote, tragic. But on Twitter this morning, Mr. Trump wrote, "In no way have we abandoned the Kurds," and said the U.S. will continue to provide them with financial and military aid. During a briefing at the White House last night, Mr. Trump said the U.S. had only a few soldiers in the area.
We had 50 in the region that you're talking about, 50 soldiers, and they've been already moved out.
The president is defending the decision as a step towards getting the country out of what he calls endless wars. But the White House is getting pushback from both parties. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell issued a statement warning that a sudden withdrawal would only benefit Russia, Iran, and the Assad regime.
This is very troubling, and again reflects a president when it comes to Syria, when it comes to the crisis in that region, who has no real strategy.
The president is warning the Turkish government that it faces financial penalties if its military engages in any unforced or unnecessary fighting.
And I'm not sure what the rules are. Unnecessary fighting. What does that mean?
I don't know, but I do know that there's the possibility that when we talk about supporting the Kurds, the president talks about supporting them financially as well as military aid. The military aid concerns me, and that means that if Turkey said already that they're going to take out the Kurds, and I'll interpret it that way if you will, does that mean we will not give them any kind of aid because we will be drawn into another fight between Turkey and the Kurds? Now, if we support them financially, that's one thing. With military aid, what does military aid mean? Does it mean U.S. troops going back into that region, fighting for the Kurds and protecting the Kurds? That would be catastrophic, in my opinion.
Yeah, but General, here's what I don't understand. You've said this is the right thing at the wrong time. Why is it the right thing at all? If, in fact, this is a stabilized, unless and until we're ready to draw lines and have some Middle Eastern summit, you know, out of Pluto that draws lines for a new Kurdistan, we've got a sustained semi-quiet in northern Syria, right, with the Kurds who are there, holding ISIS troops in jail cells. If it's only 50 to 100, you know, see, it's 50 soldiers that are in the specific area of northern Syria that will be now infiltrated by Turkey. I don't think that America, I know I don't as a citizen, consider that to be an endless war. It seems to be America's presence creating stability. I don't understand what the end game is here. What is the end game?
The end game is to move all U.S. troops out of the Mideast.
Why?
Because that is what's causing the problem between Iran and other countries in that area. Do not want U.S. troops in that region at all. Now, having said that, well, the bottom line is we're there. To move out eventually is the right thing to do. The timing of it is when we feel that the stability is based upon their own ability to take care of their own security and not depend on U.S. troops.
Well, Turkey has been clear that it's going to move in. This is not something that is lost on our military leadership. You know, General Mattis more or less left on a lot of this dispute with the president. I honestly, I don't get the idea that we're leaving the Kurds in now an open position with Turkey, who has articulated their desire to come in there and take them out, remove them, subdue them. I don't know what their plan is. And the president suggests if they go too hard and too fast, that he's going to take their economy out. I don't think anybody in America is walking around going, "Oh my God, we got to get those 50 troops out of northern Syria." I don't understand this.
The hazard, the possible, the probability, and potential is that those 50 troops, or even 10 troops, or something, any number, would become physically engaged in protecting the Kurds against the Turkey taking them out.
Because Turkey's coming anyway?
Correct.
So we're turning and running.
No, what we're doing is, once again, I said in the beginning, it's the right thing to move troops out of there. The timing of it is absolutely unsatisfactory
I
to
don't
me.
understand when the timing will ever be
The
good.
timing will be good when, if there is a Kurdistan and Kurdistan can take care of its own, Turkey stays within its borders.
And that's never going to happen. I mean, when is Kurdistan going to be constructed?
I don't know.
Yeah, right?
But I don't know. But right now, our only ally in that entire area is the Kurds.
I
What-
just don't
what
want
happened-
people to be
my-
confused
my-
by your expertise here when you say the plan is good but the timing is awful. That you're not talking about it could have been done 3 to 6 months from now. You're talking about your timing notion is based on a Kurdistanian formation, correct? Some kind of formality for
Whatever
the Kurds.
eliminates the controversy between Turkey and Kurdistan, and the Kurds rather. I don't know what that is. Is it a geographical footprint for the Kurds? Is it something that the Turkey says, okay, look, you can operate, you can be your own people within this area?
But that could be years or decades down the line.
It could.
Okay, so when you say the timing is off, you're not talking about 6 months to a year or 3 weeks. You're talking about that being the foundational reason to leave.
The foundational reason to leave is once we have stability, and I'll say that again, between the Kurds having their own piece of geography and not bothered by Turkey and vice versa. That could be a matter of agreement between Turkey and the Kurds. But as long as Turkey looks at the Kurds as being rebellious and a terrorist group, that won't happen.
Do you think a Kurdistan territory would be extricated from Turkey's border, or where they are in northern Syria right now?
The concern is it'll be coming part of it from Turkey because there are Kurds in Turkey.
Right. I don't know. It seems like it's irresistible force, immovable object there between Turkey and the Kurds, and our leaving just creates nothing but confrontation.
You're right, but you look at the option. What is the option? Do we stay?
Why not? I just keep asking us, and maybe I might be doing a really bad job of conducting these questions because why not? I don't. What is the urgency? Why not? This America's policeman thing has been oversold. I mean, America has a role in the world to keep stability. I don't think people in downtown Warwick are sitting there worried about whether or not we should have a small presence in northern Syria to keep the Kurds stable while they're holding ISIS prisoners, at bay.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
That's what I said. It's the wrong time. The Kurds
I feel
are there.
bad that you've said that 7 times, and
right.
people think I've got a listening problem here.
No. Well, I understand what you're saying. It's hard to understand. But the bottom line here is, if you totally remove yourself from that area, the Kurds have nothing at all except themselves to defend against Turkey. That's almost impossible.
And what is their military sophistication?
Nothing more than what we've seen them to
And
fight
what we've
against
trained them up
ISIS.
to help us
Right,
to do.
Exactly. And the only part we're playing right there is to serve as an intelligence gathering piece of military. It tells them what's going on. They give them some intelligence. They give them listing posts, the outlook posts, and so on. There's no physical confrontation on our part at this point. And that's, I think, a concern with the president, that he doesn't want them there to be in that position to be in a physical fight with Turkey over the Kurds. That's a legitimate reason for concern.
Do you really think that the president is making these decisions based on an organic concern and true strategy?
I don't know. I wish I could answer that.
Right.
I don't know.
I think he's just shaking it up.
I think he's been given, and once again, I don't know this for a fact, but having served in different capacities, I know that the possibility exists where his military personnel have given him options. If you do this, this is going to happen. If you don't do this, this is going to happen. And the best possible way is to ensure that we make a withdrawal if that's necessary, and someday it will be. We're not going to be there forever. So that timing has got to be correct. The timing has got to be when there's at least a reliable relationship between Turkey and the Kurds, and they don't feel as though they're being thrown over the side
I
of the
just
ship.
don't see that coming anytime soon when Turkey looks at them as terrorists.
I don't know. You know, you look at the Taliban. There's even consideration to making them part of the government. No.
Yeah,
nobody,
Afghanistan.
Yeah, nobody thought that would be a possibility. I don't know. But that possibility does exist. Maybe something could be devised where the Kurds feel comfortable that the state have a little bit of say as to what happens to them through the governments of Syria as well as Turkey. Maybe that's a solution to it. I don't know that.
All right.
But right now, we don't have that in our hand.
Final thought on this, you know, who actually agrees with this move next? Maybe Putin agrees, right? Maybe he feels good about it. Who agrees? I mean, the Republicans who have been so protective of this president on his potential legal and impeachable issues, to, I think, a ridiculous fault, jumped ugly with him this week. We've shown all the packages here today to indicate. I can't figure out and find someone of credible stature that actually will declare that the president is on the right track here.
Well, there are two people who do agree with it. That's Putin and Assad. But nobody that I've seen come forward from our own Congress that agrees with it totally. People are not making comment on it, which doesn't mean to say they disagree with it or agree with it.
What do you guess the Situation Room / Oval Office atmosphere is with military advice? I mean, when you were in your heyday, you had quite a channel. You were no low-level guy, right? So, have you wondered out loud? I mean, what those conversations are like, where he's kind of doing his own thing, and are they just like, Mr. President, hello, McFly? What are they doing?
You know, what's happening is you get the Secretary of Defense who leaves the post. You get the Chief of Staff or the Joint Chief of Staff leave. You get different advisors that leave, national security advisors that leave, and that's the end result. You know, that's a democracy. I think what happens is people make recommendations, they make observations, give him several plans, and he doesn't accept any of that because.
And I only have 30 seconds.
It's probably not a very nice place to be.
You think this is a devastating decision or just a poor one?
A poor one.
That could turn really bad.
Could turn bad. Could turn bad. It could turn good. Once again, you know, we talk about timing. You and I think of a year as a long time. In those countries, 1,000 years is a very short time.
Thanks for your point of view. Final word and we come back. You know, it was an interesting conversation on timing. The general said something very smart to me during the break. He said, you know, timing can be centuries on the Middle Eastern side. You know, we don't look at timing in the same particular direction. Anyway, timing being what it is, we'll see you here tomorrow night and on the radio between 3 and 6 on WPRO. Thanks for tuning in. Good night.